In the late 19th century, a scandal emerged in Liverpool, England that sent shockwaves through both British and American society. A beautiful young woman named Florence Maybrick was accused of not just adultery, but of ruthlessly killing her wealthy husband. However, as the sensational trial progressed, one couldn't help but question who was the real victim in this mysterious case. There's a clear medical theme in today's episode, which feels especially relevant as I've been paying more attention to my own health recently. At this stage of life, it's more important than ever to listen to your body and stay on top of regular checkups. That said, actually seeing a doctor isn't always easy. Booking an appointment can be frustrating, whether it's dealing with overly gatekeeping GP receptionists or facing long waits for appointments weeks away. By then, symptoms may worsen, or you might delay seeking help altogether. Most of us would likely visit healthcare professionals more often if the process was simply more convenient. And that's where this episode's sponsor, ZocDoc, comes in. It's a free website and app that makes booking medical appointments far easier. You can find, compare, and book high-quality in-network doctors from a database of over 150,000 providers across all 50 states. ZocDoc covers a wide range of care, from primary care and dentistry to dermatology, eye care, and over 200 more medical fields. You can search by speciality or symptom, choose between in-person or video visits, read verified patient reviews, and view real-time availability, all without making a phone call. Appointments are quick, often within 24 to 72 hours, with same-day options available. If you've been putting off care, visit ZocDoc.com/well-I-never. or use the link in the description to book a top-rated in-network doctor today. Born on the 3rd of September 1862 in the prosperous city of Mobile, Alabama, Florence "Florrie" Elizabeth Chandler was, in her own words, descended from good American stock. Florrie's father, the son of a high-standing Georgian lawyer, William George Chandler, was a partner in the banking firm of St. John Powers and Company, and one of the most eligible bachelors in Mobile society. Her mother, Caroline Holbrook, came from a prominent New York family with roots in the English aristocracy. Sadly, Florrie's father died in July 1862 from inflammation of the brain, only a few months before his daughter's birth, after which Caroline took her daughter and the girl's older brother, Holbrook St. John, to Georgia. There, Caroline met Captain Franklin Bache du Barry, who she married less than a year after her first husband's death. Their marriage, however, came to a sudden and tragic end as well when Franklin passed away, possibly from tuberculosis, on the way to the Bahamas with his wife in May 1864. By the time Caroline married her third husband, or according to some records, her fourth husband, Baron Adolf von Rock in Wiesbaden, Germany in 1872, Florrie was 10 years old and experiencing anything but a stable upbringing. Whilst she was educated both in Europe and America, Florrie was said to be altogether too delicate for college life. She lived partly with her maternal grandmother Elizabeth Holbrook in New York and partly abroad with her mother, now a baroness. As she got older, Florrie enjoyed travelling both with friends and family. And it was during one of these trips that she met a man who would change her life forever. James Maybrick was born on October the 24th, 1838, in Liverpool. He was one of 6 sons of engraver William Maybrick and his wife Susanna, though only 4 brothers had survived to adulthood. Little is known about James's formative years, but he went on to become a successful international cotton merchant. The business required lots of travel, and in 1871 he found himself living in Norfolk, Virginia, where he opened a branch office for his company. 3 years later, misfortune befell him when he fell sick with malaria. Initially, the prognosis didn't seem promising, as James responded poorly to the traditional treatment with quinine. But after being prescribed arsenic and strychnine, the cotton merchant started to feel better. In today's world, using toxic substances to treat illnesses sounds bizarre. But back in the day, arsenicals were widely used to medicate various ailments, including asthma, cholera, eczema, psoriasis, and malaria. Happily, James survived, but was left with a different kind of disease that would follow him all the way to the grave. On March the 12th, 1880, he left the States and sailed back to the United Kingdom. On the way, another passenger, a beautiful young woman named Florence Chandler, caught James's eye. Despite their 24-year age difference, the two seemed to fall in love with each other immediately, and by the time they arrived in Liverpool, the pair was already planning their wedding. At the ages of 42 and 18, James and Florrie were married at St. James's Church, Piccadilly, London, on July the 27th, 1881. The whirlwind romance wasn't celebrated by everybody. James's brothers Edwin and Michael wholly disapproved of his relationship with Florrie. How could they trust a woman her age, whose mother had been married multiple times? Nevertheless, the married couple seemed happy and soon had their first child, James Chandler, affectionately known as Bobo, 8 months after the wedding. For the next 2 years, the Maybricks divided their time between Norfolk and Liverpool before settling in James's luxury mansion, Battlecrease House, in Aigburth, south of Liverpool. In 1886, the couple welcomed their second child, a daughter, Gladys Evelyn. From the outside, it looked like the family were living a picture-perfect life in a lovely home with cooks, maids and nannies helping them with the household and children. But in reality, the Maybricks were living beyond their means. Due to the declining cotton trade, James wasn't making as much money as before, and there were cracks forming in his and Florrie's marriage. Apparently, James wasn't the easiest partner to live with due to his bad manners, ill temper, and his habit of using arsenic and strychnine to self-medicate the slightest aches and pains. Unbeknownst to Florrie, James had developed an addiction to Fowler's medicine when he was battling malaria years prior. It wasn't until Florrie found pouches of white powder in the house that she realized her husband had a drug problem. And that wasn't the only unfortunate discovery she made. By 1887, she also became aware of the fact James had a long-term mistress or mistresses. One of these women was said to be Sarah Ann Robertson, who James likely met in London before Florence was even born. The two went on to have a long on-off relationship and allegedly even had 5 children together, 2 of which were born after James's marriage to Florrie. And here is where things get even more complicated. Based on some findings and records, it's believed James and Sarah were married as well and never divorced. In some documents, Sarah Ann is listed with her maiden name, but in others she is listed as Sarah Ann Maybrick, including in the will of her stepfather. Furthermore, Sarah Ann's Bible was allegedly later found containing a note which read, "To my darling Piggy, from her affectionate husband James Maybrick, on her birthday, August the 2nd, 1865. We don't know for sure if Sarah Ann was the woman Florrie found out about in 1887, but if she was, it's not difficult to understand why Florence refused to sleep in the same bed with her husband afterwards. Devastated, she went on to take lovers of her own, which only made matters worse. It didn't take long for James to find out about his wife's infidelity, which, despite his own extramarital affairs, infuriated him. After witnessing Florrie walking with one of his friends, Alfred Brearley, at a race on Grand National Day at Aintree in March 1889, he got so outraged he hit his wife once they returned home, giving Florrie a black eye. The following day, James rewrote his will, excluding her. Although a doctor who treated Florrie for her injury managed to reconcile the couple, there was no going back. James and Florence Maybrick's marriage was coming to its end, one way or another. In the spring of 1889, 50-year-old James Maybrick's health began to deteriorate at an alarming rate. The cotton merchant had been feeling unwell for months, but now his condition really began to worry those close to him. He complained about general weakness, dizziness, and numbness in his legs. He was constantly having stomach problems and could barely keep any food down. During dinner on Saturday, April the 27th, James' friends witnessed the cotton merchant's hands shaking as he lifted a glass of wine. Despite numerous visits to the doctor, no apparent reason was found for James's worsening health. Thinking the cotton merchant was simply suffering from chronic dyspepsia, the doctors prescribed prussic acid, in addition to putting James on a strict diet and telling him only to drink soda water and milk. At first, the treatment plan seemed to work. By Wednesday, James was out of bed and back to work. But within a week, he was feeling terribly sick again, even worse than before. The doctors tried Valentine's meat juice, a medicinal beef extract, and flour solution, a tonic containing a small amount of arsenic. But nothing was helping. James kept fading away fast, and by Saturday, May the 11th, it became clear that the cotton merchant was not going to make it. That same evening, at about 8 p.m., shortly after seeing his children for one last time, James Maybrick died. Immediately after his brother's untimely death, Michael Maybrick announced to the staff of Battlecrease House that Florrie was no longer the mistress of the household and was not allowed in any circumstances to leave her room. Michael, like many others, now believed James had not succumbed to some mysterious illness, but was killed by his own wife. It's little surprise that Michael would have likely suspected Florrie of being involved in his brother's death, since he had never liked her and only ever saw her as a gold digger. But it was the young woman's actions during James's illness that convinced not just him, but many others of Florrie's guilt. 3 days before James passed away, she had handed a letter to the family's nanny, Alice Yap, to take to the post office in Aigburth. Alice, who was known to hate Florrie, happened to drop the letter in a puddle and thus was forced to open it to change the envelope. Such a thing didn't give her the right to read the contents of the letter, but she did so anyway. Dearest, since my return, I have been nursing M day and night. He is sick unto death. The message was addressed to Florrie's lover, Alfred Brearley. Instead of posting the letter, Alice passed it to Michael and Edwin, who at once forbade Florrie from participating in her husband's care. As it was now presumed James was being poisoned, his urine and feces were analysed, but nothing was found. This, however, did not dispel suspicions surrounding his wife. As it was found out shortly before James's health began to decline, the young woman had purchased fly papers from a local chemist, which Alice and the family's maids later saw soaking in a bowl on their mistress's washstand. Florrie hadn't been hiding what she was doing by any means and explained she was using the fly papers to create a solution for her face to treat some skin concerns. But the fact it was arsenic she had been extracting from the papers raised a lot of questions, considering the timing that aligned a bit too well with James's illness. Furthermore, 2 days before the cotton merchant's death on May the 9th, a nurse reported she had witnessed Florrie entering her husband's room around midnight and adding something to James's meat juice bottle. Although the nurse admitted James never drank the tampered liquid, Her statement was devastating to Florrie. The bottle was later confirmed to contain traces of arsenic. Interestingly, the post-mortem couldn't determine that the cotton merchant's death was explicitly caused by arsenic poisoning, but concluded James had died due to inflammation of the stomach and bowels set up by some irritant poison. The findings were not surprising, especially since James Maybrick had been self-medicating himself with arsenic, strychnine and belladonna for years. Over 100 bottles containing these substances were discovered in the Battle Crease house. Why would Florrie have needed to soak fly papers to get rid of her husband when there was already enough poison in her home to kill dozens of people? One could say James had been very much slowly killing himself, and yet Florrie was the one being blamed for his death. After several days of being a prisoner in her own home, Florrie was arrested on suspicion of her husband's murder on May the 14th. The coroner's inquest that followed seemingly more focused on the young woman's questionable character than on determining James's cause of death. By now, everyone knew about her affair. At the time, such a thing was considered almost as sinful as the actual crime the young woman was accused of committing. It wasn't unusual or even unacceptable for married Victorian men to have mistresses, but the wife taking a lover was an entirely different story. Florrie received very little sympathy during the inquest as she listened to Michael and her servants describing her as an uncaring wife who hated her husband. Due to unclear findings of the initial autopsy, it was decided that James Maybrick's body was to be exhumed and re-examined. Samples of his lungs, heart and kidneys were analysed and traces of arsenic were indeed found, but not enough to prove he had been given a fatal dose of the poison. Nevertheless, the jury was convinced Florrie had willfully killed her husband and she was charged with James's murder. The sensational trial began on July the 31st, 1889, only 2 months after Florrie's arrest. The prosecution and its witnesses painted the young woman as a scarlet woman who had cold-bloodedly gotten rid of her husband to be free, as the judge put it, to follow her own degrading vices. Although the prosecution failed to prove James Maybrick had died from arsenic poisoning or present any bulletproof evidence of Florrie administering arsenic to her husband, the young woman's fate seemed to be predetermined. It didn't matter that Florrie's defense argued it could well have been James himself and his known drug habit that caused gastroenteritis that led to his death. Everyone was more focused on the young woman's extramarital affair, while James's mistresses were never mentioned during the trial. Florrie's letter to Alfred was used as a key piece of evidence of her lack of morals. If she was able to betray her husband, why wouldn't she be capable of killing him as well? The trial ended up lasting for 7 days, including 2 days of summing up from Justice James Stephen, who was clearly biased against Florrie due to her affair. In her only statement during the trial, the young woman swore her innocence and tried to explain she had only purchased fly paper for cosmetics purposes. Justice Stephen then went on to tell the jury Florrie was lying. While he did mention the importance of establishing that James Maybrick indeed died of arsenic poisoning, Justice Stephen also viciously attacked Florrie's character, having no compassion for someone who could write a letter to her lover while her husband lay seriously ill in bed. In his closing paragraph, Justice Stephen stated, "I could say a good many things about the awful nature of the charge, but I do not think it necessary to say any one thing. Your own heart must tell you what it is. For a person to go on deliberately administering poison to a poor, helpless, sick man upon whom she has already inflicted a dreadful injury, an injury fateful to married life, the person who could do such a thing as that must indeed be destitute of the least trace of human feeling. There is no doubt that the propensities which lead persons to vices of that kind do kill all the more tender, all the more manly, or all the more womanly feelings of the human mind. After Justice's final comments, it took the jury only about 35 minutes to return with the guilty verdict. Florence Chandler Maybrick was to hang for the murder of her husband. The outcome of the trial was followed by public outcry. Despite people's initial opinions of Florrie, nobody could deny she had experienced injustice, and her conviction was based solely on suspicion, rumour and innuendo. Numerous press articles and letters from the public eventually proved effective when the Home Secretary Henry Matthews and Lord Chancellor Halsbury decided that while the evidence clearly established that Mrs. Maybrick administered poison to her husband with intent to murder, there was ground for reasonable doubt whether the arsenic so administered was in fact the cause of his death. As a result, Florrie's death sentence was overturned, but she was still to spend the rest of her life in prison for a crime she had never been charged with. Since Florrie was not allowed to file an appeal, it seemed there was nothing to be done to get her out of prison. The first 9 months of her time behind bars, Florrie spent in solitary confinement, which she described as by far the most cruel feature of English penal servitude. Later on, Florrie entered the stage of hard labour, starting her days at 6 a.m. and washing potatoes and scrubbing 20-foot tables in addition to other chores until 5:30 p.m. That was Florrie's life for over a decade before finally, in 1901, her sentence was fixed at 15 years. The decision was made shortly after Queen Victoria's death, who had been known to be convinced of Mrs. Maybrick's guilt. In 1904, Florence Chandler Maybrick walked out of prison as a free woman. After visiting her mother in France, Florrie returned to America, where she lived as a recluse for the remainder of her life, never seeing her children again. Before her death on October the 23rd, 1941, at the age of 79, Florrie wrote a book about her experience, Mrs. Maybrick's own story, My 15 Lost Years. To this day, the question still remains, did Florence Chandler Maybrick poison her husband, or was she a victim of prejudice as a Victorian woman who didn't follow society's expectations? Well, I'm sure you'd agree that was an intriguing case. Please, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.